Hello, everybody. My name is Olivia Cross. I am a third-year MFA candidate in the School of Theater. And so I want to talk to you a little bit today about both my professional practice and my teaching practice and the methods about how I go about that. And so to communicate those ideas with you, I want to look at a very specific case study that I've been implementing here at Penn State. And so in this case study, we're going to look at two productions. One is titled Urinetown. These are both musicals, and the second is Sweeney Todd the Demon Barber of Fleet Street. And I'll give you a little synopsis of those when we get to it. But first, I want to talk a little bit about myself and my artistic mission. So I'm a firm believer in combining professional practice with education, as well as research, and intersecting all of those through the field of theater and performing arts. So my artistic mission is to create theater that inspires and invigorates all generations, to instill a lifelong passion for the art form, to co-create and to uplift voices, to create an environment of art everywhere, and to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in doing these things, I'll show you a little bit about what that looks like for me. But first, I want to go back to how I came to this field of study and to this passion. So two things, really. One, I grew up with a family that is primarily farmers. I'm a first-generation student, and so I have a long tie with agricultural industry and sustainability of the earth and that relationship and what it can teach us about relationships of nurturing and giving back and having that be a symbiotic relationship. And so this image is actually my great-grandparents. And this is important for two reasons. One, to demonstrate that relationship with the land, but also what we're doing here is actually prepping potatoes for plant in the spring. And one of the things we used to do during this activity is tell stories, some of which I'm sure were true and some of which I'm sure were entirely made up, but that instilled in me a passion for storytelling and what stories we are telling and why we're telling them. And then I got into theater at a very young age. And then as I got into continuing training, I kept hearing this idea that, oh, theater is this incredibly powerful art form and it's so good for you and it's good for the community. And yes, I believe all of those things wholeheartedly. But then I started thinking about the consequences of maybe of our art practice and the making of this, particularly in that relationship with the earth and giving back. And then I stumbled upon this quote, which is, some people in theater believe that we are above climate change, that theater is inherently good for you, and therefore nothing in our work could be harmful, and the attitude that we are above this needs to change. And I think that really kickstarted me on this journey of, yes, I want to be able to keep telling these stories and instill the next generation to be able to tell those stories. So what can I do in my practice and in my teaching to change that? Did we jump? Okay. And so what I wanted to do was think about my own practice of art making and the process of script selection and play season and then the actual production. So I'm a scenic designer by trade. So I design what is on stage and the environment that actors perform in. But also I'm an educator in teaching students how to do those things, the craft, the technical skills that go into that. And so in this process, both in practice and in education, I've kind of reframed this method of design production into and this comes from a concept from Tanya Beer, who is a scenographer and educator based in the UK. But it's replacing the 3 R's, and we're all familiar with the 3 R's, right? Reduce, reuse, recycle. So reframing that through a lens of arts and production to be co-creation, celebration, and circulation. And I think what this does is it marks celebration, and we'll talk about the other two. But celebration, when we think about theater, we think about celebration as opening night, right? And you go and you celebrate and you've made this wonderful piece of art and the audience comes and it joins you. But then not a lot of us think about what happens after. And traditionally, for those of you who don't know, what happens after is the show closes and everything goes into the dumpster. And that was not always traditionally the case, but in our method of consumption and production as ticket sales, that is, so I'm trying to reframe that to this new idea. So looking at co-creation, circulation, and celebration, my big ideas with co-creation is I want to be place-based. Be open to local and serendipitous opportunities and the resources that are around you. So many theaters and communities have this wealth of resources, both when we talk about material cause as well as stories and narratives. So being open and inviting them into our spaces of performance. And then allowing what is available to guide that process. And this is when we talk about the material cause. So instead of designing and then finding a material, I propose we inverse that, find the material and then figure out what we're going to do with it. And then engage our audiences in the work before opening the night. Invite that community into the creation of that process. And then we talked about celebration. I want to celebrate these stories. I want to do the work, celebrating along the continuum of this. And then circulation. And this is where what the case study I'm going to look at is focusing on. Take into consider the afterlife of both theatrical materials, both the design and the construction process. So what happens after closing night as opposed to just going into the dumpster? And then thinking about sustainability as a valuable resource and advocating for sharing of cultural ideas, networks, and tools. So maybe we've done something that the next person can learn from and continuing that circulation in that way. And so this idea comes from this idea of nature and the biometric of things coming from a thing and going back and being cyclical in that way. So what I am talking about, so in this case study, I'm going to look at two productions at Penn State Center Stage, one of which happened last spring, and one of that is actually coming up in a few weeks that I invite you to celebrate with me. But so what we're really looking at is three scenarios about which we can go about producing theatrical experiences. One is we're going to design a show and we're going to buy whatever we want, and we're going to put it on stage and we're going to put it together. And the second is we're going to look at new materials, low carbon materials, and putting those on stage and being really intentional about those in the construction phase, not considering them in the design phase. And then the third option is really this idea of reused and repurposed materials. So that goes back to that idea of what is in your community, what do we have, and then what story can we tell with those things. And I want to focus on the second part of this number. So there are some things in a theater that is already established that I, as a student in this case study, do not have control of. And that would be gas, electric, waste, water, transportation. That is the institutional placement of design that I am using as my foundation. But what I can control is scenic materials and how I go about designing. And so taking stock of the now. So the first show is Urinetown, which if you don't know the narrative of that show, it is a community of people dealing with the crisis of their community after a water shortage and the aftermath of that on both the socioeconomic impulse as well as the relationships. And so what I was the scenic designer for Urinetown, and I worked with a fabulous team. And what I did is I used Urinetown as a baseline for how Penn State is doing in terms of that last category of those numbers when it comes to sustainable materials. So I designed this show thinking about those first things of co-creation. What story are we telling? And that's how we landed on Urinetown. And then who in my community can help me tell that story? But what we didn't consider, what we read about as normal course of action, was the design process. So being new to this theater, I went through the design process, not considering any of those considerations and taking stock of where we are in terms of carbon neutrality. And so what I did is I evaluated cost per material as well as labor hours. And so anything that was reused, the money that would have been used to build those things, and the labor hours that would have been used to build those things, and looking at the relationship of where we are currently at. And so in the breakdown of that, we found that just about 60% of any materials used in the scenic production were new materials, with about 30% being reused or recycled just by the nature of our stock and of university. And so what I did with that data is coming up in fall, opening November 15th, is Sweeney Todd. And so when talking about season selection, I proposed to the company, I want to do a show that focuses on sustainability, and I want to increase those numbers with a goal of 50% of recycled and reused materials being 50% of our main stage production. And so we landed on Sweeney Todd because Sweeney Todd, if those of you who've seen the movie or know the narrative, takes place in London, just past the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, in a time when the Industrial Revolution was creating environmental impacts on both the people, the socioeconomic class, and the infrastructure of the city. So much so that people in the lower class cities next to the factories were having to board up their windows with these fabrics to avoid having the smog come in. So we decided what an excellent story, among other things, love, revenge, and also everyone knows Sweeney Todd. So that is engaging the community in a narrative that they might always be familiar with, but undertone it with kind of these ideas that we're applying to it. So taking stock of the now, before we even picked this show, I said, what do we have? What does Penn State have? And what does the broader community have? And I found all of these lovely textures and materials when we talk about material costs that we had. So fake tin ceilings, real metal ceilings, drops that had been damaged. Unfortunately, we had a flood in our downtown theater. Drops that were damaged and could no longer be used as transparencies, but were still a viable material. So taking stock of that, I proposed Sweeney Todd and it did get approved. And then we came to the design phase and the budgeting phase. And so what you're looking at here is kind of a midpoint check-in of what would eventually become the scenic design for Sweeney Todd. And I want to call attention to two things. Anything that is in orange is coming from our stock, directly from our stock, pulling from what we have of already built materials. And then the green is those damaged drops reconfigured in a new way to give essence of that boarding up of these London environments. And so what we were able to do, and actually in the numbers, we actually reached 70% of reused and recycled materials in Sweeney Todd that it will be put on our main stage, as well as reaching out to community members of where these pieces go afterwards, whether that is Thespian Society, whether that is summer stock theaters, whether that is being reused in the classroom. And so what you're seeing here is a video that's not playing, but this is a classroom that I teach, which is Intro to Scenic Design. And I said, what if we took them out of the classroom and we let them paint our set? And they're like, well, these are intro students who've never painted before. And like, do you want that to go on stage? And I was like, yes. Like I instill in them the power to be like, you're not going to do this in a classroom. You're going to do this, what goes on stage. Good. That was, well, it would play. And then talking about co-creation, and I know I'm running out of time. Theater by nature takes a massive amount of collaboration and inviting to that table. And so these are just a variety of the shots that we have just for scenic design. So we have our scene shop that builds things, we have props, we have paints, we have technologies and integration. And so one of the biggest things, I don't know how to turn your volume down, I'm scared this is going to be really loud. The set design for the show integrates automation. So this is what's called the turtle, and I'll let it play. So that is a feature that is about 18 feet wide and it can rotate 360 degrees as well as track the full 40 feet of our stage. And this is important for storytelling and the mobility of the characters in the show. But I want to call attention to that particular piece because what we've done is we've partnered with Virginia Tech to borrow the automation to allow our students to learn that in the classroom and put it into production on our main stage. As well as we applied for grants for some of that technologies for acquisition for Penn State Center Stage. So after Sweeney Todd closes, that unit, which is new materials, will actually be recycled into a 22-foot turntable that Penn State will have as a capital acquisition for all future shows. And then lastly, I want to call attention to this massive list of names, and this doesn't include our donors or anyone you actually physically see on stage. This is just the hands that have touched this production. So I am one of them, but there is a massive community backing this production. So this is a bit of an ad, but also this is me inviting you to that celebration to see what this looks like in its entirety. So this QR code will actually bring you to the ticket website for Penn State School of Theater. I invite you to come to this show. I will encourage you those with, it is family friendly, but perhaps not our young children if you know the story of Sweeney Todd. I encourage you to check out this one as well as any theater production in our School of Theater and to come talk to me if you have questions about what we are doing to insight our initiatives of sustainability. And I just want to close with this quote. You begin with the small, you begin with the doable. You begin with that which you can do under the most repressive context. And in doing it, you make the repression retreat and you change the terms. So that is my presentation. Thank you.